Have you ever wondered what happens when a legal system itself starts breaking the rules? Is it just a string of unfortunate errors, or are we looking at active systemic sabotage? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into today in this explainer. We're unpacking a really revolutionary way to analyze legal compliance using something called the coherence model. Normally when we talk about compliance, we picture a basic checklist. Did someone break a rule? Yes or no. But the source material we're looking at proposes a much deeper macro-level approach. We're going to explore how we can actually measure a court's deviation from standard law and figure out how to tell the difference between a functioning justice system and one that's basically working against its own principles.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The breakdown of procedure. 2. The 3D volume of justice. 3. Zones of human agency. 4. Measuring coherence. 5. Crises and sabotage. And finally 6. Redistributing weight. Let's get right into it. All right, part 1. The breakdown of standard procedure and what happens when the system deviates.
So we have to start by asking ourselves a pretty crucial question. What actually happens when a legal system fundamentally deviates from its own standard procedures? Because if you're trying to measure real compliance, your very first metric has to be looking at how far the courts and agencies have strayed from common law and acceptable practice.
Now, when you look at the source data, the sheer volume of procedural failures is staggering. And we aren't just talking about typos on a warrant here. We're looking at unidentified arresting agents, massive escalations of force for totally nonviolent allegations, and literal due process vacuums. This sets up a clear, measurable deviation from standard law. It's an absolutely massive red flag for non-compliance.
I think this quote really hits the nail on the head regarding how institutions can game the system. As the case files outline, rather than thoroughly investigating the facts of an alleged crime, they use things like psychiatric competency evaluations to completely bypass rigorous evidentiary review. It's a procedural shortcut, and it fundamentally alters the landscape of justice.
Moving on to part 2, the 3D volume of justice, thinking about justice as a bounded object.
Okay, so instead of viewing a court case as just a flat A to B timeline of events, the coherence model asks us to visualize a legal case as a three-dimensional volume. Think of it like a physical box. It's a bounded object of state power, and its structural integrity depends entirely on 3 distinct axes holding it up.
For any legitimate legal proceeding to stand, it needs these 3 load-bearing pillars. You've got your x-axis, which is width. That represents the adversarial struggle, meaning a fair fight between defense and prosecution. Then the y-axis gives it depth, representing the severity and duration of the crime. And finally, the z-axis provides thickness, which is the heavy, undeniable substantive proof or evidence.
Now, if a legal system is truly compliant, it maintains all 3 of those axes, creating a stable 3-dimensional space. But here's the catch. If the state removes even one of those axes, the whole thing loses its structural integrity. It flattens out into this authoritarian 2-dimensional surface, where fair play literally ceases to exist.
Let's break down what that collapse actually looks like in the real world. If you pull out that z-axis, meaning you have 0 substantive evidence, but you still have a prosecution and a sentence, well, you've got yourself a show trial. Remove the x-axis by stripping away a person's defense, that flattens right into an administrative detention. When a court allows justice to collapse into 2D, it's no longer a legitimate judicial process. It just becomes a guilty by decree machine.
Which brings us to part 3, the 5 zones of human agency. Let's contextualize the action. Now that we have mapped the system itself, we need to map the human beings caught inside it. Because human behavior doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? The self is just the innermost circle, and it's nested within and, frankly, compressed by much larger causal architectures like the situation, the circumstance, the broader culture, and ultimately the world at large. By breaking down these 5 layers, it becomes super clear that circumstance and world events severely compress the probability landscape of a person's behavior. For instance, a starving person and a wealthy person technically both make a choice, but they do so under radically different conditions. The law usually only looks at that tiny inner self, but a true compliance analysis has to look at these outer rings, or else the law is just totally blind to reality.
All right, part 4, measuring institutional coherence. This is the new standard of compliance.
This is absolutely crucial to understand. The source texts make a really profound assertion here. Law is downstream from the world layer. That means massive macro crises dictate what actually happens inside the courtroom. If the world is going through a massive shock, the legal system gets warped by it. So any accurate measure of institutional compliance has to account for those heavy external pressures.
So, real compliance isn't just about whether a specific, rigid rule was broken by a single person. It's all about coherence. We have to ask, is an agency deviating from the law? And if they are, is it because the departments within that legal system are becoming overly coherent with external chaos and macro events, rather than remaining coherent with actual justice?
The source material actually provides a mathematical heuristic for this. Coherence equals the base signal minus the sum of your contradiction and overload penalties. Essentially, if that overload penalty gets too high, say from a sweeping global crisis, the entire system's coherence score just plummets.
Let's jump to Part 5, External Crises and Sabotage, Mapping the Macro Cycles. The data maps out some very specific generational macro crises here. Look at 2016. That was a rupture phase defined by structured chaos. Then 2020 hit us with massive institutional stress during the pandemic. And 2026 points toward a major global reset. These aren't just random historical dates. These are massive generational turning events. They exert extreme external pressure, effectively warping the legal system's 3D volume of justice that we talked about earlier.
So how do we actually define systemic sabotage using this model? It happens when a court or agency has a super high deviation from procedural standards, meaning they're acting unjustly and breaking common law, while simultaneously scoring incredibly high on coherence with an external crisis, like a fourth turning event or organized chaos. When courts basically facilitate the crisis instead of buffering against it, they're no longer practicing law. They're literally committing systemic sabotage.
Which leads us to Part 6, Redistributing Legal Weight, a true paradigm shift in accountability.
Traditional law judges the isolated individual, right? It only looks at that innermost circle of human agency. But the coherence framework demands a total paradigm shift. Instead of just asking if a rule was broken by a single person, we absolutely must ask how fractured the system was that produced the behavior, and frankly, how broken the court is that's judging the event.
Because systemic sabotage fundamentally alters the whole landscape, the actual weight of an alleged crime has to be handled differently. Think about it. If the courts are operating in a collapsed 2D space, entirely stripping away due process to facilitate a generational turning crisis, then the circumstances have totally diverted from the standard. Therefore, the causal weight has to shift away from the individual and heavily toward the non-compliant system itself.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, if we use the coherence model to audit our institutions and we find high procedural deviation mixed with high external chaos, I want you to ask yourself a question. Where does the true responsibility lie when our institutions become the very source of chaos they were designed to control? Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the architecture of the systems around you.